Our final item on the agenda is the appeal from District 24 Senate election. So come forward.
Morning. Thank you for allowing us to come and address you today. You should have in front of you two presentations. The skinnier one is mine. The bigger one is the addendum. I've weaseled down this presentation to a...
Could you both identify yourselves for
Sure.
the record, please?
Corey McDonald. I'm an attorney out of Hampton Falls, and I live in Brentwood.
Lou Gargiulo, and I'm from Hampton Falls.
Thank you very much.
So the smaller presentation is the one that I'm going to be working off today. Gotten this down to a slim 7-hour presentation for you today, so just kidding.
Make it skinnier.
Yes, make it skinnier. No presentation from a lawyer would be complete without a disclaimer on the front page. I'll sum that up by just saying this is the product of about 700 hours of work that Lou and his volunteers have done after the election, looking into how it went in District 24. Nothing in this is supposed to be casting aspersions on any person, any moderator, any clerks, or any town. This is a sum of what a lot of lay people found and looked into, and then I was asked to take a look at it and present it to all of you, and to shrink that presentation down into something manageable. So that's what we're doing today. Lou is obviously seated next to me. I also have, there's a number of volunteers I think here today, most of whom I don't know. I was not part of Lou's campaign, nor was I one of the volunteers who looked into this. So I've asked some of them to be here who actually did the hard yards and the groundwork. Michael Bean, who worked on the recount, 91A requests, Al Brandano, Linda Brown, James Goodwin, and there's others. And the reason I asked them to come here is because you may choose to ask me some questions that I can answer, and then you may choose to ask me questions that have not nearly enough information to give you an answer on. So I've asked some of the people who did the hard yards and the work to be here in the audience in case you have direct questions for them. My name is Corey McDonald, and I'm here to present it. Our goals are to provide examples of what has been discovered and to try to obtain your assistance in a forward-looking action plan, with the ultimate result being defendable election results, which is what we all want. What we're not here to do, which I think is just as important as what we're here to do, we're not challenging the election. We're not asking for a redo. We're not saying that it's wrong and that we want you to take some sort of action. So this is an after-the-fact look at our elections, our systems, our processes, and what we think we can do to maybe help improve those for future elections.
And I would add that after the election and upon the filing of the appeal, we had a pre-hearing conference, and I commend the candidate for making that claim, for making that clear in that thing, so we didn't have to have an emergency hearing and worry about the incumbent or the successful candidate being sworn in, and that resulted in this presentation, and I thought that was very responsible of both of you, so thank you.
Thank you. So if you'll humor me, I've got two quotes that I want to start with. One is Part 1, Article 8 of our Constitution, our New Hampshire Constitution, which I just think is wonderful and on point on social virtues. Frequent recurrence to the fundamental principles of the Constitution and a constant adherence to justice, moderation, temperance, industry, frugality, and all the social virtues are indispensably necessary to preserve the blessings of liberty and good government. And this is the part that I think matters for today. The people ought therefore to have a particular regard to all those principles in the choice of their officers and representatives, and they have a right to require of their lawgivers and magistrates an exact and constant observance of them in the formation and execution of the laws necessary for the good administration of government. And then the second one is a quote that I just like from our own Daniel Webster. Impress upon children the truth that the exercise of the elective franchise is a social duty of as solemn a nature as man can be called to perform, that a man may not innocently trifle with his vote, that every elector is a trustee as well for others as himself, and that every measure he supports has an important bearing on the interests of others as well as on his own. I think the way we look at this presentation and this material is important, because we all look at it through our own lens. And the elephant or donkey or both in the room is not to look at this as a partisan issue. This isn't a partisan presentation. We're not going to talk about conspiracy theories. We're going to talk about the really good, strong policies and procedures that are in place, that the Secretary of State's office has in their election manual. But then we're going to talk about the need for training, for systematic review, for follow-up, and ultimately for holding people responsible to make sure that those things happen. So I think it's important for you to know, what lens did I look at this as? I know Lou is a businessman. I've known him as that for years. He approached me and asked me to take a look at what his group found. And I will tell you, which I don't know if I've even said to Lou, I looked at it with a very skeptical eye. I initially thought, what if knowing all the people that follow Lou and the passion that comes with it, what if it's his volunteers and it's more of a sour grapes type thing? And that's being blunt. That's how I initially looked at it. But when I saw these things, I thought that no matter what lens you look at this as, you can't help but see, wow, there's some room for improvement. There are things we can do better and do differently. And I picture things as, if I was explaining this and going through these materials with my two girls sitting at the kitchen table and saying, is this the way it should go? Well, first they're 11 and 16, so I'd have to get them to put their cell phones down. But if they then paid attention to Dad, and I said, look at the pictures of the boxes, look at the logs that aren't filled out. Is this the way we expected it to go? Does this follow the very good policies and procedures that have been set up? I'd be hard-pressed to convince them of that. My background is almost 2 decades in law enforcement, and I was a detective for a while. And while that doesn't necessarily apply here, the correlation I made in my head when I'm looking at our policies and procedures in law enforcement and the changes we went through decades ago, where instead of the evidence getting tossed in the trunk, driven around town, and then eventually brought to court in a couple weeks, we package it, we label it, we have redundancy, we have signatures, we have witnesses, we have evidence tape. And that's for the kid you catch, smoking a joint in Prescott Park in Portsmouth. If we're taking that type of time and energy and effort to make sure his constitutional rights aren't violated, to make sure that there is process and integrity in that process, obviously our voting system is just as important, I would argue, more important than that case. And so the correlations I made in that slide here talk about other executive branch changes. And I'm recognizing really from my experience in law enforcement, system over outcome, right? When I used to train cops at the police academy or field training officers, I would talk with the ultimate example of, you pull the car over, it's the serial killer and he's got the dead body in the trunk. But if you get to the dead body the wrong way, that evidence doesn't come into court. And of course, they get the protest, but then the bad man goes free. And the answer to that is yes, because we believe through our laws and through our case law in this state as well as in the country, that system matters more than outcome in any particular individual case. And that is what we're looking at here. What are the systems that we can tweak and that we can really enforce? Redundancy and verification. Again, making that comparison to the kid you catch smoking. That marijuana is put in an envelope. It's weighed. Every crease is labeled with red evidence tape that shows tampering. A supervisor comes down and checks the weight. We double sign on it. It gets locked in a locker. And that's for what back then, when I was working, was a Class B misdemeanor. We need to put at least that amount of effort into preserving our ballots and protecting them. And then policies and procedures. I referenced the Law Enforcement Attorney General's Manual, which is sort of the Bible for police work in this state. SOPs, certification and audits. Having people that are third party come in and be able to look and check what we did. So our focus here was on the District 24 election, obviously, in the 7 towns. What was discovered by the volunteers was systemic issues that the good news is can be addressed. Nothing in our arguments are saying, hey, let's go change the Constitution, we need a whole bunch of new laws. What we need is to look at the systems and processes and ensure that we're enforcing them, and more importantly, that we're doing trainings on them and auditing them. We found RSA law violations, incomplete or non-existent chains of custody, failure to follow the published policies and procedures that we have in this state, electronic ballot counting device problems. And one of the things I want to differentiate there is, right, we heard about devices, and I don't pretend to be any type of an expert or anywhere close on devices. But the devices are only as good as the systems that puts in the information, the pre-tests that are done, and we're going to talk a little bit about those here, and voter registration issues. I won't spend a lot of time on this slide because you all know more about it than I do. The standard and where it comes from, New Hampshire statutes, revised statutes annotated chapter 652 through 671, our election laws and procedure manual, and the big one, continuity of operation plans for when things don't go as planned. This is, I think of it as the Murphy's Law plan of everything can go, and I'm Irish, I think I'm still allowed to say that. So everything, will go wrong that can go wrong. And so let's have a plan to deal with it. And what that does, it eliminates that person who stands in that awkward position when something goes wrong, trying to figure it out. And it eliminates people like myself or others coming in after and finger pointing from the stands as to what they did. This means we've got a plan already in place. The issues that we found were with the absentee ballots, the devices, the chain of custody, the discrepancies, the continuity of operations. So I'm going to look at the absentee ballots first. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these. As I think probably everybody here knows, there's an issue on constitutionality that's pending before the Supreme Court, and that's not our issue. I'm not really getting into that here today. What we do want to talk about is the separation of ballots from the affidavits and envelopes. How do we reconcile those, right? That's the check and balance, and then the second element is you have to know your starting number of absentee ballots to be able to reconcile. Like most lawyers, I come to you with some issues and not a whole heck of a lot of solutions for everything. What we're going to ask at the end of this is for that deeper dive, because you certainly aren't going to get enough just out of me talking at you for a little bit here. But we're highlighting that issue to take a look at. New Hampshire RSA 659:30 states affidavits have to be sworn. The absentee ballot has to be accompanied by that affidavit. The moderator has to examine the affidavit. And also, if they're using absentee ballots as the fill-in ballots, my understanding they have to be signed and dated by the moderator. So we think there's some lacking checks and balances, and there's not a lot of evidence that that occurred. The slide with the highlighting on it that's titled Before Election Day just talks about the establishment of the election manual that's up to date on laws and procedures for conducting elections, that puts some responsibilities on the moderator to work with the selectman clerk and election officials to develop a continuity of operations plan. Again, my Murphy's Law. So there's a sample plan in the manual, and it has 39 shalls in it, and shalls, as we all know, are important. It's listed as a responsibility of the moderator on the checklist of responsibilities in the election manual. It requests that each plan be shared with the Secretary of State. That's in our RSA, which references the manual, which asks for it to be shared with the Secretary of State's office. None of the 7 towns in District 24 have a continuity of operations plan. And when you have things that happen like the voting machine going down in Exeter, that's where that matters. That's where that plan's important. And when you hear us picking today, but this wasn't done when the machine went down. The memory card wasn't tested. All these different things. Those are things that would, in my imagination, be captured in that continuity of operations plan. What to do when something goes wrong. Test all ballot counting. So this slide is the one titled Steps to be Taken Before Election. Test all the ballot counting devices and memory cards at a publicly noticed test. Maintain the security logs for each device, storage bag, and memory card. And as we all know, working in government, a lot of that is so you can respond to that Fund 91A request that eventually comes in to show we did it right. Here's the evidence. Whether it's law or banking or otherwise, we know we have to preserve records depending on the type of records for a certain amount of time. Prepare a supply of absentee ballots and affidavit envelopes for accessible voting on election if the counting of ballots to establish a starting inventory as required by RSA 658:31 before Election Day. Post a notice of the date and time when the ballots will be counted. Collaborate with the moderator, in conducting a public count. Test all ballot counting devices and memory cards. So here we have testing before the election is required per RSA, required per the election manual as well, and the procedure per the election manual requiring the use of 50 ballots for testing. And I try to make some references in here, and that addendum, which is jam-packed with reading materials there, is so that you can take a look at it on your own. The tapes tested prior to the primary election, in this case, on some devices, but not prior to the general election. And that's problematic, and we're going to show you where that happened. The Secretary of State and the Department of Justice don't have oversight on the chain of custody of the memory cards programming or the ability to read them. It's LHS Associates proprietary software, and the wording is that the memory cards, the way it's been explained to me and I understand it, have to be immediately returned to LHS after each election, not stored with election materials for the 2-year requirement per RSA 637.3. We talked about it's well documented that programming in test mode is not necessarily reflective of election day mode, and so that's something for further conversation and people who know more about it than I do to talk about. And then I reference again the addendum materials. So looking at Exeter, right, Exeter is responsible for the most votes in District 24. There were machine tape discrepancies, chain of custody issues, missing information from the logs. There's no completed maintenance logs or activity logs in an election year. No documentation on file with the Secretary of State or LHS when the machine crashed in the general 2022 election. And when I say these things in these absolutes, I would certainly be going, well, who says? Well, a lot of this information came from 91As that were sent in and questions that were asked and responses. Those results are mostly in your addendum, and I should again reiterate, tip of the iceberg, bigger piece of the iceberg, and then there's piles of affidavits, photographs, and witness testimony that should be looked into. No continuity of operations plan, we talked about that. And then the next slide, this is the machines, which confused me initially. There's 3 base machines, so to speak. So when machine 3 crashes, and we talked about the spare, or machine 4, what we're actually talking about is a new memory card. That memory card was replaced without identifying the card or the number that went with it on the log as required. There is no evidence of a testing performed on it. It's referred to as machine 4 in the next couple of slides. So here you see with the photograph of the log, and admittedly some of the photos in here, unless you have eagle vision, are going to be a little tough to deal with, but they're bigger in the addendum. The memory card was replaced and used in the election without any testing. And the memory card number is missing, which you can see in that picture where it says memory card and there's nothing there. You'll also notice in the right-hand column that witnesses are missing. And some of I guess the umbrella to a lot of this discussion is going, if we have policies and procedures that say you must put the number of ballots on the outside of the box, we have a label that says that. We have a label that says 2 witnesses. We have the Attorney General taking action in 2019, which we'll get to in here, saying you have to actually do what we say. You got to sign both witnesses. You have to put the number of ballots. You have to do these things. If we're not checking up on them and holding people to it, then we should get rid of the labels. We should bring it down to a level that people will do. But right now, we set ourselves up by having these policies and procedures, and we're not following them. Precinct 3, machine 3, also spare machine 1, LHS maintenance in the activity log without required second witness. So this is again, I refer to the DOJ, which is the next slide, which is a glimpse of the letter that's in the addendum. No memory card identification number listed. Slide 19 is just a picture of the Exeter cease and desist letter from the Attorney General's office in 2019, which illuminates a lot of the same things we're talking about and shows that this is not a one-off. This is a systemic issue that we have to work on. The memory card activity log. Machine repair performed without identification or the work performed. The missing card number identification is missing. The repair work performed by LHS with only 1 witness, when the RSA and specific form instructions mandate 2 witnesses. Again, I can't help but think of my prior career and our Intoxilizer 5000 breathalyzer device. If we wanted to change a tube or do anything with it, there was a log. You had to have the name of the person who did the work, what they did, and witnesses. And why? Because that individual who eventually gets arrested for DWI, his constitutional rights are so important that we have to show that chain of custody in that little case. So again, I just make the correlation. If we're doing it for that individual in that case, it's certainly worth doing here for our elections. Dates of testing. So this slide shows the 3 test slips at the top of it and the dates. There's supposed to be testing before each election. So we see machine 1, 2, and 3. If you look at the bottom rocker, it has the date. So machine 1 is 11:52 a.m. on July 30th, 2022. Machine 2 is 13:46 or 1:46 p.m. on 10/26/22, and machine 3 is 14:09 or 2:09 p.m. on 10/26/22. Next slide gives you sort of the analysis, which the big problem is machine 1, where it hasn't been tested. It was tested, it looks like, before the primary in July. The primary is obviously in September, but not tested as it's supposed to be before the election. So again, when you hear from the people who talk about the devices and the accuracy, I'm not really even contesting that right now. That's not part of this presentation, but it's, okay, but you got to follow their rules for it to be accurate, and we're missing things here. And we all know human error is going to happen. We're going to miss things. Things are going to happen, but there's got to be that redundancy to catch it. So the test tape recap, top of the slide, machine tape 1, the date's wrong. 2 and 3 look good. The test dates and times are correct. Machine tape for spare 4 has the wrong date, 7/30/22, and there's no activity in the log for 7/30/22 when that test is supposed to have happened, which doesn't make any sense. The zero tapes are the next slide. Now these are the tests that are done to show the machine is zeroed out and there's nothing in them. Machine tape 1 shows that the zero tape was performed at 11:55 a.m. after the polls opened and had a wrong date of July 30th, 2022. Machine tape 2 appears with the correct date, and so does 3. So 2 and 3 look good. Machine tape 4 now has the correct date, unlike from before. And the time shows 7:42 p.m. and the polls closed at 8 p.m. So something is off there. Our Freedom of Information requests, which come next, show you that the machine that went down in Exeter went down at 2 o'clock, and the new one was online at 3. But the zero tape test shows 7:42 p.m. So something isn't lining up. And again, you can see the 91A responses. I shouldn't say the responses, because the only response in here is the one shown. There are many more in your addendum. And this shows, according to the 91A response, again, what I just said, 2 goes down at 2, it's on at 3, but the tape shows differently. The next slide shows the missing SHA values from the tops of machine 1, 2, and 3. Those are the unique identifying numbers. If you were to, well, you can even look at the slide right before it. You see that SHA at the top. It's not on these slides down here. And you can see the date and times, 2:03 in the morning, 21:12, and 18:46, or 6:44 p.m. The next slide shows the results, right? This is what the 4 devices that were used. So again, 3 devices, 4 memory cards. What their results were. So if you look at that bottom rocker, this is the 4 slips all in a row titled Machine Tapes Ballots Cast. At the bottom of 1, it's 2,498 votes to 2,509, or it's 508. My eyes aren't very good. 3, 2,909. 2, human error. We'll come to that. I counted something wrong in here. It was just to illustrate a fact, I swear. And machine 4, 502. So the interesting thing here, right, is if you look at that next slide, the ballots cast compared to the time in use for machine 4. So machine 4, the spare, the zero start is 19:42 p.m. or 19:42, which is 7:42 p.m. The election, right, stop time 21:12. The polls closed at 8 p.m. That would mean that it had exposure to voters for 18 minutes and had 27.8 ballots passed through it in a minute to get to 502. It doesn't make sense. So something's off. It deserves an explanation, a little bit of a deeper dive there. Seals on boxes. Exeter had security discrepancies found by the volunteers during the recount on 22 of the 22 ballot boxes. This slide is misleading because I titled it wrong. I put seals on boxes, and that would lead one to believe that 22 of the seals were broken. That is not what this is saying. Seals on boxes is a bad title. It should just be, what was found on the boxes. So when we talk about 22 of 22 ballot boxes having errors, they did. Some were seals, some where the labels weren't filled out right, some where the boxes were open. And we'll get to that. So the election manual, and I think this is important really just because of the detail that went into it, the time and effort that somebody took to go, let's categorize how to do the election correctly, how to separate the ballots correctly. Seal and certify ballots in the presence of the selectman or their designee. Place the cast ballots, the canceled ballots, the uncast ballots, the ballots from any additional polling places, and successfully challenged absentee ballots in the boxes supplied by the Secretary of State. Mark the information on the seal. Apply the seal to the containers to the clerk. Ballots go in boxes labeled in red ink, ballots. Absentee voting materials, including all successfully challenged and rejected absentee ballots, go in the boxes labeled in blue ink, absentee voting materials. There will not be a quiz on this, because if there was, I would fail right now, but you get the detail and the level and the time and energy that it went into and why that's so important. And obviously, the point I'm going to make is that isn't getting always followed, and it's getting missed, and it's getting mistaken, maybe through a lack of training, maybe through human error, maybe through a lack of resources, but we got to deal with that. That next slide shows you an example of the package list that goes on the outside of the boxes. And this is where I was talking about, where at the top of that list it says number of cast ballots, number of canceled. It's looking for a number. It's looking for a list of signatures. It's looking for witnesses. It's required information per the RSAs. It's not voluntary. It establishes chain of custody. And when we talked about 22 of the boxes, what you can see here, well, you can barely see in my presentation, but again, the addendum, is the spreadsheet of the boxes and what was found and what was missing. 100% non-compliant. No quantity of the content listed on the boxes. The incorrect use of the boxes, per the description that I just gave you. No moderator signature, no selectman signatures, no clerk signature, no date or timestamp on some of these. That next slide that starts with the bullet, multi-district 24 towns with violations common to Exeter, lists Greenland, Rye, Northampton, Stratham, Hampton Falls. Again, incorrect use of boxes, incorrect counts, incorrect identification of content, meaning boxes that said unused ballots, had ballots in them. Incorrect date and time. It requires a deeper dive. It requires people to take a working group or an ad hoc committee and go, hey, let's explore this. Let's meet with volunteers. Let's take a look at what they found. And let's take a look at just how we can shore this up, how we can make it better. Sealed ballot boxes, chain of custody and storage log. Right? Checklist of responsibilities. Per RSA 659-98, 4 of the 7 District 24 towns completed the form. 3 of the 4 completed it correctly. 3 District 24 towns failed to utilize any form at all. So what is our safety check? Who's in charge of catching these errors? Who's in charge of going, all right, how do we correct it? How do we make sure it doesn't happen again? There's a picture on the next slide of the chain of custody with the RSA reference. And again, this is 91A available material. So the average person can go, I don't know how many average people are using the 91A, but people can use 91A to look and fact check and take a look at these things. So when we look at chain of custody, after the election, sealed boxes are stored locally, and we have a storage log, which I think we all know about. And it's to track the initial storage of the boxes and of the ballots and the absentee voting material, any and all access made to the boxes, any transfer of custody or removal of the boxes. So this is a really important document when you want to make sure there's veracity in what are in those boxes. Exeter, Rye, and Greenland did not fill out the required storage logs as required. The photo is just a sample of Stratham's. The Northampton Town Clerk's Office didn't fill out the required storage log, and according to one of our volunteers, per conversation with the town clerk, when the state picked it up, they filled it out and signed the log because they needed to, because they're picking up to transfer. But that doesn't follow actually the RSA. It's not how it's supposed to happen. And when I look at this in the chain of custody and think of how much work, and I'm very familiar with town clerks. I've had the privilege of speaking at their conference a couple of times. They are some of the hardest working people I think in our local government, and I'm sure they wish they had an Irish coffee in the morning when reading some of our 91A requests, and they did a good job responding to them, even though I'm sure we were frustrated at times. But when I look at the amount of work that's on those town clerks to do on a daily basis in small town New Hampshire, to track all these boxes, they have to be given a roadmap of how to do that. They have to be given an availability and a basis to start from. And I think there's some level of frustration that, hey, we're doing the best we can. And that's understandable, but we have to be able to improve that. And accidents happen. Human error happens. It was a month or so ago, I think we saw a hotel throw out a box of kids' passports from England. And we all saw that. And nobody was doing that on purpose. But issues like that happen. We got to make sure that things like that don't happen in our community. So when we look at the other chain of custody issues, evidence tape, right? The void open boxes, floating labels, no moderator's signature. And so this is a laundry list of the stuff I'm about to show you, right? Missing moderator and selectman signatures, missing town clerk signatures, missing timestamps, missing ballot count, questionable counts, wrong content, incorrect content on labels. It's about boxes. So this is the recount. November 26, 2022, at the beginning of the Senate race recount. Here's a picture of the box. Now the way evidence tape works, if you don't know, it's a piece of red flimsy tape and it's got a backing. And you peel the backing and you put it down. This is my recollection of how it works. And you put it down on the box, and then if it's messed with, it rips very easily. And some tapes, like the kind we use here, show void, opened. It tells you there's a problem. So you're looking at this box and you can see in the picture, it said void, opened. Now what does that mean? Does it mean there's a grand conspiracy to go in and plant ballots? No, not necessarily. It could be an error, it could be something happened. But we don't know because we don't have a chain of custody with it. We don't have the ability to answer that question for people who might be naturally skeptical as to why it looks like that. Next slide shows the same box, 17231, signature label, appears to have been moved from the top of the box to the bottom. Second photo shows the red tape attached to the signature label, which is another indication that was moved from somewhere. Why was it relocated to the bottom of the box? Who knows? We don't know. We can't make assumptions, but we should be able to answer that. No moderator on the signature on 5 of the 6 Greenland boxes. Photo shows the example of the Greenland boxes. And so the important thing, right, you can have people make these accusations, but we have the photos, we have the labels. You can see it for yourself there. No moderator or selectman signatures on 12 of 22 Exeter box labels. Again, there's the photograph. No timestamps on signature labels, all 22 of 22 Exeter boxes. Photo shows example of Exeter box 172397. Ballot counts are not listed. So this is the one where I was talking about where you look at the top, where you're supposed to put the number of boxes and there's an X. Some boxes are mislabeled. This is the uncast ballots when the box had clearly cast ballots inside it. That's Exeter box 172412. So the election day marked checklist records 100% of the voters on November 8th election day. The Exeter marked checklist recorded 8,529 voters. Now the moderator's worksheet, the return of vote, and the recount should match, and we all know the reality is with human error there could be a change, there could be a discrepancy, but that is how you reconcile, because eventually these things should match. The Exeter records all contradict. The official return of vote document, 8,540. The machine tape and hand count results, 8,532. The moderator's worksheet counts, 8,518. The actual number of voters on the checklist, 8,529. The Exeter tally at the recount, 8,514. They're all different. Exeter voter reconciliation shows a variance to the checklist listed in the far right column. The check-ins, the return of votes, and the recount total. The slide down below it, the summary of recount accuracy. This is in the senatorial race, and it shows the total votes, the recount tally, and the return of votes. And so the recount added 70 votes to candidates that hadn't been reported, 92 votes to candidates when compared to the machine tapes and write-in details. We all know in New Hampshire our elections can turn on a vote, and maybe in some bigger states that would sound like not a big deal, but as we know here, they do. Electronic ballot counting devices determine the elections, not the ballots. The candidates gained 94 votes at the recount when compared to the tape results. There's 2 illustrations after that. One just shows the return of vote in blue and the machine hand count recount. You can see there's some big discrepancies in certain towns like Exeter, Rye, and Hampton Falls. The next slide, where my recount error is, absolute discrepancy, recount versus return of votes, District 24 state race, I say 154 votes misreported. But then when I actually double checked, it's 157. And I just did that, of course, to illustrate human error and how I'm not immune. But this shows you overall the spread, and the spread between the towns. And I think this illustration is helpful because it goes, okay, it turns these numbers into actual real votes in real towns. And we talk about permanent movers, 2,378 voters who permanently moved between August 2020 to August 2022. 91A request said, hey, we took that into account, we dealt with that. How is that possible? And so we would like that looked at. Hampton Falls, overvotes. Here they report 27 overvotes at the bottom of that ballots cast list. And yet in every election they report 27 overvotes. I can't say it's impossible, but it's super, super unlikely. And either way, the numbers don't match then. So again, any one thing of these that you're looking at is not the end of the world. It's the totality of the circumstances and the number of these errors, oversights, accidents, whatever we want to call them, that lead us to go, okay, let's make sure everybody's trained. Let's make sure we're auditing and checking. And then for the person who raises their hand and says, I want to be the town clerk, the moderator, whatever, there's obviously a level of responsibility that comes with that authority. And somebody has got to follow up with this and make sure it's done correctly. Senate race votes reported versus the total town ballots. So again, this slide is just to show you that there's a difference between the return of votes in the Senate race and the total town return of votes, which in theory should match. The only one I see matching is Rye. Not just a District 24 problem. People have heard about the Wyndham issue where there were some folded ballots through ovals, which is alleged to have happened again in 2022, along with other additional allegations. That's before the AG in a complaint. The point being, we can make these, the District 24 isn't a one-off. We can make these changes and improvements throughout our state, and so we're guaranteeing our children better elections, strong, secure elections for the future, which is, I think, what we all want, no matter what side of anybody's aisle you sit on. We all want to know that the contest is accurate. The ballot counting devices, altered without witnesses when 2 are required. So they have specific rules, as you all know way more than I do about and have heard from these people. There's altered hardware or software that's not reapproved. And so that's memory devices not being labeled, or memory cards not being labeled, memory cards not being stored, swapped out without oversight or proper documentation. Again, I point back to that, what do we do when something goes wrong, which the election manual says every town should have. Moderator runs a machine in test mode, and according to the DOJ, that's all that's required by their July 12, 22 correspondence. So one of the things that the volunteers have been frustrated by is there's kind of a shrug at times going, well, listen, I don't have the teeth. It's a legislative problem. I don't have the laws to enforce it. I don't have the authority. And that used to be something that you heard a lot in law enforcement too. Well, that's not my baby, not my circus. And it wasn't because of lack of caring, it was because maybe it was true, they didn't have the teeth. But at some point, some group with authority and some group with credibility has to go from an overarching public policy point of view, this is problematic. How can we fix it? How can we make it better? How can we ensure that New Hampshire, which is known for its veracity, for its lifestyle, for the voting that we do here, and for our integrity, how do we continue to lead the nation in that? We have to make some changes and make sure that we're enforcing, again, the really good policies and procedures that people took a lot of time to put on paper. Next slide just talks about, just to bring it home, right, April 2nd, 2023, that's earlier this week, Sandown, 666 votes cast. And just to illustrate, every vote counts, right? That's a small number of votes. And here is an election that was overturned, right? 217 votes became 271 votes. So when we think of that impact that has in our small towns, not just on the people running and their families, but it matters. These things are real and they really affect real lives, and it's really important. Lou Gargiulo's crew of volunteers, 700 volunteer hours. This is just a selected survey. In looking at all the documentation they had, I felt like the dreaded editor with somebody's movie, Hollywood movie that they made that has all this great info, and I'm cutting out pieces because I know I've got to fit it into this presentation. But I would tell you there is a wealth of information that is worth looking at. And none of it has to be looked at with casting stones at anyone. It's just looking at it going, hey, our state always strives to be one step ahead of everybody else and to be better, and to have better systems, processes, and policies. So what is our ask? If we were at a fundraiser, this is when I'm asking you to get your wallets out. But luckily, you don't have to give me any money. Our ask here is set up an ad hoc committee, set up a working group, put something together. And if you say, well, I don't have the authority to do it, then call for it. Because somebody somewhere has got to take notice and go, the Secretary of State's office has done a great job of putting policies and procedures together. There is a disconnect between policies, procedures, and the fundamental application of them at the town and city level. And we got to correct that. We can correct it. And you'll have tons of volunteers to do it. And it should be one of those things where we get people from both sides of the aisle to work on this together. So we're asking you to use your authority to do that. We're asking you to make written recommendations for consideration by the Secretary of State and the Attorney General's office to further ensure fair and accurate elections and to effect positive change. In the alternative, if you listened to this or you looked at these books and said, I'm not moved, I don't buy it, I'm not interested, I would ask you to do the courtesy for the volunteers of giving us a written response that just outlines why, what your thoughts are behind it. Because these people put in a ton of time and effort. And I made the joke to Lou, I go, when I present this, most of the volunteers, I go, where's my part? I did a ton of work. I had to be very selective on what I put in here and give you that tip of the iceberg, but there's so much more left. This request is blind to party affiliation, benefits every one of our systems, our citizens, and our candidates. And again, I go back to the lens that I look at this with, and which, you know, we would get harped on to apply in police work, which is if your kids were sitting with you, if your parents were sitting with you, what would they think of what you're doing? Is it right? Is it the right way to do it? And sometimes you get it right, sometimes you get it wrong, sometimes it's your fault you get it wrong, sometimes it's a system. Here, what I think we can all agree and look at, if you buy the information that I just showed you, is that we've got a lot of great people in this state. Many of them are clerks, many of them are moderators. So we have the right people. We've got a lot of good policies. Some might need to be tweaked, but we've got a Secretary of State's office that has put together a good voting manual. The disconnect is in the training, the auditing, and then the responsibility when something goes wrong to ensure it doesn't happen again. So I want to thank you for listening to me. I've done a lot of talking and not throwing the addendum book at me or anything like that. I'll open it up to any questions you might have, either for me, for Lou, or some of the people who actually put eyes on the material that I showed you. And if you have no questions, that would be it.
I have to comment that you did that without a glass of water and without any apparent taking of a breath. So I think that was a remarkable performance.
Thank you.
Just to clarify, and I think it's inherent in what you showed, in this election, there was a recount.
Yeah.
The recount confirmed the result
Yes.
of the underlying election night results, and you're not contesting the result of the election.
So to be clear on the record, we are not contesting the result of the election. We don't want anything done about the election. We are not using this as a stepping stool to go, hey, let's get a redo. And by taking that off the table, hopefully it eliminates some of the skepticism that might come with that. With that said, if the $1 million question is, can you tell us that this election was done accurately? When you look at all this stuff, I'm not going to tell you it wasn't done accurately. But I'm certainly not going to tell you it was. I'm just going to tell you this is the evidence, and I'm not the smartest person in the room who should be making decisions on that. But you guys are all in a great position to look and just use it as an example and look forward looking at next elections. I'm working really hard not to get sucked into what brought us here, what was the impetus. But when Lou looked at this, and once we got past and decided we're not looking for any recounts or any redos or anything like that, it was, what's the importance here? What actually matters in this thing? Did that election matter? Yeah, of course it mattered. But what's the bigger, broader picture? Systems over outcomes in any election, right? So we just want the system to improve, and if there's any system improvements that come out of this, then it turned out to all be worth it.
Okay.
Are you aware that the Secretary of State's office has run extensive training for ballot people working the polls?
Yes.
They're not short, they're 4 or 5 hours long each, and more than once. I should have addressed most of what you have said in here.
Yeah.
I know that in our town, none of these things occurred. I'm looking at them as they're going through, and I've followed it very closely throughout the entire election process, and none of these things occurred in my town. All the paperwork was signed by all the selectmen, was signed by the moderator, was signed by the town clerk, and each box was identified by all those people who were there. Those things are very, very important, as you pointed out. The enforcement is, we'll look at that.
Yeah, and you might be 100% right that maybe the training's great. And my background's not in voting law. I don't know. I don't know the answer. And I do know the Secretary of State's office does trainings. I don't know if there needs to be more, or to your point, or if it's the enforcement. But I know, and again, I keep picking on my law enforcement background, but we did a lot of trainings, and sometimes we still got it wrong. And the way that we got it right was sometimes a little bit painful. When you get a kick in the butt and you're told, hey, you got that one wrong, and then you try to do better.
Mr. Secretary.
Thank you for the presentation. A lot of good constructive criticism in there. Some of the items that you mentioned, we are working on. Others we're not, but certainly could be. But the one thing that I would like to convey after the presentation is that what you just talked about is a snapshot in time. And if you go back 20 years and see where we were then and where we are now, there have been major improvements made along the way. And that's not to say that we're where we need to be. We're always playing catch up. But 20 years ago, there was no statewide centralized voter database. Every community in the state kept their own checklist, whether it was on a spreadsheet or handwritten in some of the smaller towns. There were no uniform boxes that were used to place ballots in. And there were no logs kept on certain functions. And and I've said this since I've been Secretary of State, that it's incredibly important that all the processes surrounding elections are transparent, open for the public, so that all of the warts and pimples and stuff are visible. And that's how we give confidence where there are problems, we can address them. So, the other side of this too is that the individuals that run our elections are all elected at the local level, and there's a constant turnover, constant training. Some people are better at the jobs than others, but they all give it, their 100% best shot. And so it is, it's easy to see where we would like to be. Sometimes it's a challenge getting there. We all have to step forward and face that. But I think moving forward, there are a lot of good projects that are in the works right now that will help address some of the concerns you have. Some of the ones about the AccuVote machine are going to go away, as we transition to new device. Coming up with better audit systems after elections are over. But we hear you.
Thank you.
And in your requests, you recognized one of our dilemmas. We are a creature of the legislature. Yeah. They give us authority and they limit our authority, and if they didn't like what we were doing, they could say goodbye. They also create the laws that would create all the requirements that go into the election manual. Every time I read the election manual, I get a headache. And every time I think about running an election, I'm glad I'm not a moderator. We have no staff. We have no authority to even technically. We agreed to hear this because we thought you should be heard somewhere when we had our pretrial hearing. I think the only authority we have is to refer all of this good material, and I don't take any of it lightly, and I don't take any of it with anything other than accepting what you say, and I assume the other commissioners are the same way. But the only authority we have is to refer this to the appropriate place for investigation, and the appropriate place, I believe, for investigation is the Attorney General's office, not the Secretary of State's office. Although I'm not stupid enough to just refer it to them, I'm going to suggest we refer it to both offices to discuss and examine and learn from, and see if it raises any questions that rise to the level that the Attorney General thinks needs action. Because I think you've done a huge, and all these people have done a huge amount of work. And we want our elections to be as reliable and confidence-inspiring as possible. And we want our rules and regulations to be followable, if there is such a word. And I think we have a system that makes it, having talked to a lot of moderators and town clerks about all the things they have to do to comply with every rule and regulation that exists, we may have created the perfect system that's impossible to comply with.
Sure.
But I would accept a motion, if it's all right, from somebody to refer all of this material to the Attorney General and the Secretary of State.
Okay, I ask a question first? You want the motion first?
You can do whatever you want. Yes, you can ask a question.
I wanted to ask, have you sent this to the Secretary of State and or the Attorney General previously?
Not in this sort of combined form. I know some of the volunteers have been involved in other voting action groups, and things may or may not have gotten submitted. But as part of this, we didn't also send this to anyone.
So if I can follow up on that? So you haven't, but has anyone else requested action already from the Secretary of State or the Attorney General with respect to this election for the State Senate and the issues that you've brought up today?
I don't believe
No.
so. No.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
I'll make a motion that we forward this matter to the Attorney General's office and Secretary of State's office for
Okay.
further examination.
Second.
Can I speak to that just for a second?
sure.
I'd just like to say, this is very thorough, very thoughtful. I think everybody on the commission appreciates the non-accusatory tone of it, which is, it shows a lot of data here. And certainly a lot of hard work from a lot of people. So, but I think it's, obviously what the chairman says, it's not, and I barely would cure this problem, or we have no magic wands here, but we would, but it should be investigated by the people that are responsible for elections.
Thank you.
Discussion.
Yeah, I'm still deciding how I'm going to vote on this. And one of my questions for you is, did I hear you say you are not saying the election was accurate? Did I hear you say that?
Did you hear me say I'm not saying the election? No, I don't know if I'm following or if there's too many negatives in there for my brain
And
at
I'm
this
sorry.
point after
So
that.
are you saying the election was accurate? Are you saying the election was not accurate? Or you're not taking a position?
I'm not taking a position. I'm saying with the data that I've seen and my limited frame of reference of understanding of this material, I wouldn't be a person who would ever come out and look at this and go, oh, so I think everything's fine. But I'm also not going, oh, I think the results are wrong. The information is here. Somebody else can make that decision. I'm not taking a position on it because I think it almost becomes a trap to take a position. I don't care as much about this election, with no offense to Lou and all of his volunteers, as I care personally talking about me and why I'm sitting here today and why out of all the cases that I could be involved in, I'm here, is because I care about the system. And I think the system is what we refer to hopefully the Attorney General's office and the Secretary of State's office. And the election becomes an example. But the system is what matters and what our kids will care about.
Sir.
For the record, we invested a huge amount of time, talent, and treasure in putting this together, recognizing that the election result wasn't going to be changed, nor was that our desire. Our desire, though, was to have the most fundamental responsibility that we all have, and that's to ensure our elections are accurate and that all of the processes that are in place lead to that end. This particular investigation led us to believe there are sufficient issues in the process that need to be addressed in some way. As I think the senator said earlier, there's a lack of teeth in the process where if a town, and I'm not picking on Exeter, but like Exeter has had multiple investigations done by the Attorney General's office citing them, and we found the same things years later, the same problems. That tells me we have a fundamental issue that nobody is addressing, that someone needs to address in statute, where if a town continues to fail in enforcing the policies that Mr. Scanlon's office has put in place, they need to be penalized. May it be financially, may it be criminally, in some fashion, they need to be penalized. People have fought and died for our elections, and they have a right to believe there is a fair election process. So we're looking to you, we're looking to the Secretary of State's office, we're looking to the Attorney General's office. and maybe to the courts at some point, somebody needs to take a position and resolve this.
Okay, there's a motion. All those in favor say aye.
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 No,
Yes.
Okay. 4-1. The motion passes. I will make sure this gets to the Secretary of State's been here. He's heard it. He's got one of them in front of him, but I'm going to formally send it to him. And I'll make sure it gets to the Attorney General.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for all your hard work, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.
I'll take a motion to adjourn.
Before we do, are we gonna talk about our schedule at some point? How
We're
are we do
gonna,
that?
Dave and I are gonna work out a proposed schedule and get it to everybody.
Okay.
So, motion to adjourn?
Secretary Stanley, anybody ask questions or is it at all?
I'm the chairman, he's not.
Oh, sorry.
And the answer is this is not a public hearing. So there's a motion to adjourn. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Motion is adjourned.
Croc TV.